Welcome or welcome back. This is Pairs Wealth Knitting. I'm Jennifer, and this is a knitting podcast all about knitting, yarn adventures, and travel. Thank you very much for joining me today. So excited that you're here, and we get to sit and chat and talk about knitting. So get comfy, get cozy, and we're going to dive in. This is the final and third part of a series all about cable knitting. So excited to be finally doing this. I look back at my notes and I realized that I had not done this yet. I have released already, if you haven't seen, a part 1 and 2 of my cable knitting series. Part 1 was all about knitting inspiration with a variety of patterns that I curated at a variety of knitting levels. My second part was everything I knit cables, and today is tips and tricks. So if you are thinking about knitting on cables, have been inspired by knitting on cables, are currently knitting on cables, I hope you have some tips and tricks to take away from this that you can use and apply right away or in the future. What I'm wearing, we'll start with that first because she's very cable-y, and I did talk about this actually in my last part of the cabling series. This is a Moby sweater. This is an overall cable work sweater. This particular pattern is the junior edition by Petite Knit. So this is intended for children, but if you've been here for a bit, you know that I am not a giant. So the junior size works well. I also went off of a slightly bigger gauge with the yarn. The yarn is a worsted weight. It is by Peace Fleece, milled by Hairsville Designs. So it's a mix of wool and mohair. Gorgeous yarn. It's their very first colorway in a cream, and it's just gorgeous, just a delight. I wish you could squish and feel and smell. She's very sheepy, which I so enjoy. I'm not gonna go on about the sweater because I will have done that already in my last video. So go check that out if you're interested in hearing me wax on about the Moby sweater. We're gonna talk about tips and tricks for cable knitting. Before we do, I'm just here to remind you that if you have not already done so, highly encourage you as you are knitting all of your smaller little knits to enter our giveaway for the hashtag Little Knits KAL. That's Little Knits Knit Along. Every hashtag that you include on Instagram with a reel or post will automatically enter you in a randomized draw for 2 prizes. One prize is from Laverne Hops, and it's their small envelope wallet, all leather, gorgeous. I've talked about it, so please enter. The second is from the Mariner's Daughter, which is a yarn shop in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and they're offering up a $25 gift certificate. Such beautiful prizes. These are my favorite things. I hope they are yours too and become yours. So enter the draw. You just have to follow those makers and hashtag Little Knits KAL. You're already knitting all of the little things. You may as well win a prize as we knit along. The winner will be announced in the first 2025 episode that I air. So that's how you're going to find out if you won. That's it for the Little Knits KAL. On to the tips and tricks. I have how many? I have 7 tips and tricks to share with you as I've discovered through my knitting journey of cabling. So we're gonna dive in, let's do it. So first of all, I must talk about yarn choice. This is my first tip. Of course, when we are deciding what we wanna knit with our pattern, of course, we're getting excited about things that we may have seen on Instagram, on someone's body, perhaps on YouTube, gosh knows where we've seen this, Ravelry. And now we're thinking, okay, we have to knit this cable work, sweater, vest, accessory, whatever it may be, which is amazing. Of course, we are invited to use the intended yarn or paired yarn from the designer for that particular pattern, or as I like to do as a naughty knitter, go a little rogue. And I think allowing ourselves the freedom of adventure of pairing a new or different yarn with a pattern is really liberating and can create such beautiful things in the end. With that being said, For knitting cables, what I would highly encourage you to do when we're planning to pair this beautiful yarn with a pattern, two things to consider when we are doing this. One is the texture of the yarn. So fiber, I mean, I think we can be fairly liberal in what we're choosing. Obviously, plant-based fibers are never my favorite. I would never recommend them for a cable work motif. You definitely want something that has some give and elasticity to it, because the whole idea, the definition of cable knitting is taking strands or your stitches and placing them out of order, which is stretching that stitch further. Therefore, having an elastic yarn or something with some give is a definite advantage when knitting cables. If you knit with something that didn't have a lot of give, not a lot of elasticity, a plant-based yarn, for example, that is going to be really tough for your hands. It's going to allow you to knit for less time and limit you, which is really sad, I think. And as well, you're probably going to see that manipulation and tugging on your fabric. So really encourage you to have something that's elastic. Coupled with that, we want to talk about the smoothness of yarn. The smoothness of yarn really allows for cables to pop more. If we have something that we're looking at that is fuzzy, so this could be things with mohair in them or mohair alone, you're going to get a haloed effect that's going to take away from the crispness of a cable. That might be the look you're going for. This actually applies to color work as well. And this is actually, some designers are getting into this, which I think is amazing. And I actually like the idea of kind of a little hidden gem, if you will. But if you're someone that you really want to showcase the cables, consider a smoother yarn as well as an elastic yarn. I'm gonna go kind of like out of these two options, I'm gonna go like a part B, if you will. So with that, I wanna talk about color choice. I have knit a variety of different things in cables with different color choices. Obviously, if we're knitting cables that we really want to allow to shine in the fabric, light colors is your friend. But I really feel that dark, moody cables is a delight for wearing, for the eye, for the knitter, and for the observers. I've knit cables as well in dark colors, and I just find they're fantastic. They still allow the eye to see, especially if you're outside with actual sun, not like us today. But it just allows, I think, for really beautiful fabric to be created. All black cables, I have knit that as well. And those aren't as stunning, I find. They are very hidden. But if you want to go for dark grays, definitely something that has a heathered effect can be a showstopper, in my opinion. So, I mean, just being considerate of color. With the texture of yarn, I also want to bring up yarn types that I kind of already did, but talking about if it's a plied yarn versus an unspun. This is, I've even have a video all about unspun yarn because I do adore unspun. I hope you do too. And I don't want us to think as knitters that we cannot work unspun into cables. We can. I've done my, goodness, what did I do? Snowy Forest sweater by Midori Hirose in unspun and in dark, actually. So it's kind of going against all of, I think, the really popular ideas or traditional ideas of cable knitting and pairing it with an optimal yarn. In my opinion, cables with unspun are beautiful. I hope you can understand that, of course, working with unspun does bring its own interesting pieces of experience. So this will be elastic for you, but there's a point of elasticity that the strands break, and they do break quite easily. So allowing yourself perhaps to perfectly match, gauge needle size, perhaps even the material of the needle. Consider perhaps a wooden needle over a metal needle for sliding and that kind of thing. That could be helpful. But I definitely think that an unspun yarn is completely lovely for cables. All right, I could go on about yarn choice, but we are going to press on to number 2. Number 2 is practice with simple patterns first. Every knitter's different. We're all different learners, of course. So I think you have to do what you feel you're excited with and motivated by. I know for myself, I was very interested in cables from the very beginning. And one of my very first sweaters did have a cable in it that I put in to a sleeve. I just inserted a really simple motif. I think it was a 2x2 cable, and just ran that throughout the sleeve. It was really interesting to do, and I felt like a bit of a champion for conquering the cable. But of course, there's a bazillion types of cables to choose from. I would say to build confidence that this is what you're after, and I think an understanding of how cables can work. Try simple patterns first. In my pattern roundup of my first, the part 1 video of cabling, there were some great options there. Basically, smaller number of stitches would be worked around. So maybe a 2x2 cable, for example, instead of a traveling cable motif could be an option if you're wanting to build up confidence. Otherwise, go for it, go rogue, and just have the patience to rip out and know how to read your stitches would be my recommendation. Number 3 is cabling without a cable needle. This is an entire game changer, and I think a lot of people have already started talking about it. I'm definitely not the first one. I didn't invent this, but I am a definite, sounding horn of cabling without a cable needle. All it means is that you do not have to have anything extra other than your knitting needles that you're knitting up with your yarn. If you were going more traditional, perhaps you might have a cable needle. I'll insert some images here. I had one, I lost it. I think a cool one that I've never tried are one of the bendy flexi cables. That could be cool. This allows your stitches to be on hold as you're working your stitches out of order so that you don't lose them. That's the whole purpose of a cable needle. And often cable patterns will recommend that you have this as part of your tools that you possess as you're going through the pattern. It is not necessary. Every cable I've ever knit after my first sweater, I haven't used. I think some people that have only done a cable needle will think I'm bonkers. This entire sweater, I never touched a cable needle, and I wouldn't want to. So here's what I do, and I don't know if this is everybody, but it's something that I would call, if I had to name it, like a pinching technique. I actually came up with a whole bunch of tutorial videos last week now that you will have maybe seen that are correlated with my test knit that's in testing right now with gorgeous knitters for the plug and play slipover. That's going to be coming out in January. I will not talk about that tons yet because I will when she's coming closer to the date. But with that, there was a pinching method for one of the techniques that I was using. So let's get in.
Okay, what I've done here is I've just knit up a simple swatch with 2 different cables. The cables are a 2x2 cable, and we're just going to work this up and show you how I do a pinching method so that I do not have to use a cable needle. Well, cabling makes life so much easier. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to work those stitches to the cables, and then I'm going to sew it right down when we get to the cable section. So we've got a couple knits and a couple purls. I later on talk about the neighboring stitches and what is best to be putting on those sides. Now that we're coming up to the 2x2 cable, I've slowed it down so we can see what's happening. So I'm going to be using my left hand to push off those stitches from my left needle, and I use my right hand to literally pinch those stitches not to lose them. I place the stitches back on in the correct order that I want with my left hand needle, and with the remainder stitches, I take my right hand needle, fish the needle through those stitches, and place them back on to my left hand needle in the order as by the pattern. So I haven't needed a cable needle and have just worked, or I should say, replaced the stitches in the order to cable. So now I just, of course, go through and I knit my stitches as I would that are now in that correct or appropriate order that the cable stitches are needed to be done. I've got one other sequence of cables I'm going to be showing you. So I've got a little purl stitch that is hanging out right in between of my cable, two sets of cables. And same idea, I'm going to be using my left hand to throw off the stitches from my left needle, pinching with my thumb and my index finger of my right hand. I'm placing those stitches back onto my left needle. With my right needle, I'm picking the stitches up that need to be out of order, that are still off the needle, and I fish them onto my left hand needle. All done without a cable needle. Super easy and doable. And I find, I guess, with this method, with the pinching and the yarn choice and the gauge, I've never had a problem losing the stitches, even with more stitches that are required for cabling outside of and above and beyond 2x2 cables. And again, I've done whole garments in this method with pinching, and I find it works really well. I've just sped up the speed so you can see just finishing off the row to regular speed, and we're ready. We've got our cables that have been cabled, or I should say our stitches that are being cabled. There we are, cabling without a cable needle using the pinching method.
All right, so cabling without a cable needle, I find, is obviously so much more efficient. It's obviously, for me, having anything extra in my hands other than two needles, I find very clunky, finicky, and this eliminates that completely. It allows me to go rogue. I shouldn't say rogue. It allows me to feel a lot freer when just pinching my stitches and replacing them back on the needle. This allows me to travel as well, or commute very easily when I'm cabling. And I do all kinds of knitting on public transit, for example, or in the car. And so I don't have to worry about, did I bring my needle? Did I drop my needle? When I was wearing a bun all the time, many moons ago, I would shove a cable or even a DPN in my bun and use my bun as kind of the placeholder for that extra needle when needed. This, I don't even have to worry about it by pinching my stitches. So that's cabling without a cable needle in a nutshell. It may be exactly what some other knitters do. It may be very different than what other knitters do. I'm not exactly sure how other people cable without needles, but that's how I do it. And I hope you give it a try, and I hope it works for you, because it changed my cabling life. All right, next up is neighboring stitches, which I did just super briefly touch on. So when we're knitting cables, I didn't realize this as I had started venturing into knitting, and of course got excited about cable knitting, is that it really depends what your neighboring stitches are, what makes cables pop or not. So knitwear designers know this, of course. So they are very strategic by placing specific knitting stitches, or I should say stitches, beside or that neighbor your cables. If you do a stockinette stitch, for example, that's beside a cable, it's going to wash into that cabled stitch, and you're not going to have that pop that you want. By placing, for example, purl stitches that go and flank or neighbor your cables, it's going to allow it to pop more and become more 3D, if that makes sense. Your cables, or I should say, sorry, your purl stitches are sitting more flush. When you have the V's of your stockinette stitch, if it was knit stitches, it would blend in too much, in my opinion. I guess it depends what you're going for. But this is where designers often will use that knowledge and know-how to, again, neighbor cabling motifs with purl stitches. Again, that allow, can you see? Like that allow those cables to really pop and sing. The next tip and trick I have is tracking your work. This I could talk about for 5 years, but I'm going to really try to be concise in this one. So tracking your work, you can do in a variety of ways. You can actually track your physical work, say you're knitting straight or in the round, with motif sections, just placing a stitch marker, even a light bulb stitch marker between those motifs. And that allows you to see if it's a motif of, say, 10 stitches each that are in your cabling motif. you've put in place a stitch marker every 10. So if you have to, first of all, I think it's visually a lot easier to see where those stitch patterns lie and what stitches you have to do where. But if you have to rip back, hopefully you can check just those sections and have it much quicker just to rip back that little section than ripping back like the whole row, for example, or worse. I also want to share in tracking your work, the deciding factor. Am I going to talk about this? Yes, I am talking about charts later, so I will be careful with how I say this. Tracking work with sticky notes or on iPhone. So allowing yourself as a knitter when you're tracking your work to record somehow the row that you're on. Yes, we can read stitches, and if you are a seasoned knitter, reading stitches may not be challenging, which great. So hopefully you may not have to record exactly what row you left off on. However, if you are in a more detailed, more, challenging cabling pattern, this could look really similar to other rows you have, maybe that row exact motif will have been repeated on multiple rows instead to create that stitch or motif. So writing it down somewhere, tracking with a sticky note, as kind of archaic as that sounds, but it's definitely helpful. Including this in your notepad of your phone if you're out and about, or if tech is your thing and that's easier for you. But definitely somewhere writing down the row that you've left with, for me, is essential, especially because I'm a bouncy person. So I'm sitting, I'm knitting, I'm up, I'm out. I may forget exactly where I am, even with the ability to read stitches. So recording the row that you left off on. Tip 6 is checking your work. So this kind of goes with that whole motif set I was talking about with the stitch markers. I feel it is so much easier, and I'm kind of almost like, do as I say, but don't do as I do, because I'm talking the talk, but I may not be walking the walk, if you catch my drift. I find it so much easier to check our work fairly consistently as we're going and knitting, to make sure that we've got the right stitches, the right, not only stitch count, but the motifs are done correctly. We've definitely cabled in the right way, flopping out those stitches and putting them in the correct order. Because again, to check our work is so much easier than to go and rip back. I find ripping back cables isn't that fun. And it can be quite a challenge sometimes. And I know in knitting this particular sweater, because it was so heavy set with charts, I found that I wasn't able to go off and make mistakes often, if that makes sense, because I feel like I was so concentrating on this knit. However, mistakes of course they happen. So I was able to rip out like a section and then, go down that scary line of like 6-8 rows, whatever it would be in that section, to rip back and re-knit all of it. I find I got really good at that with this sweater, being able to read the cable stitches and not having to rip out entire rows, because that's really heartbreaking, I find. So checking your work checking your work allows you to catch those mistakes earlier, even if you're not checking every row, but checking every few rows, even though that's a bit of time consumed from your actual enjoyment of knitting. It's done so in a good way, because you're not hopefully having to rip back as much if you just continued and kind of ignored the checks. So I would definitely say check your work as you go, take that time and consider it a great investment for making your knitting cable dream come true. There we are, checking your work. Last bit and the last tip and trick I will share with you are charts. I've got a lot of feelings about charts. I love charts, and I actually would prefer charts any day over written instructions. I find charts are great because they're so visual, they're quick and dirty to look at and to mimic in my hands. So there's that really quick visual for me. I also like charts because if you already know what the symbol means, you can bang it out. With the chart, though, sometimes with cables, the charts can be multiple charts, even within one row. So kind of compiling those in your brain, if you're just using a phone, can be super challenging or next to impossible. Another thing is tracking your work is a little more challenging as well. So you can write down like, oh, row 57, whatever, on a sticky or in your note, that's fine. Another way to do it is screenshot your chart, and you can circle, or even I sometimes like finger, and we'll write the number of the row that I'm on there. This is the one time that if you are considering printing out patterns, this could be it. Printing out a chart for cable work, I actually find this is a preferred method when there's multiple charts and when the cables can be quite detailed. We're not just talking a couple cables that are going back and forth, or like a 2x2, 3x3, but this is like this pattern. I had started without printed charts, and I realized quickly that that was a mistake. I did print in the end, and so glad I did. Something like one of the hats that I did from Tilda. I'll include the name. I think it was in a holiday gift knit pattern roundup that I had last year. I knit a whole bunch of these. Very simple chart. It had like a horseshoe cable, and it had I think it was like literally like a 1x1 chart. Super easy. Didn't even have to think about printing the pattern. And of course, because I knit it so many times, I knew it up by heart. So you decide. You're the boss of your knitting. I would say printed charts. And what I do want to say, the last like little chunk of the charts, a sticky note I use on the physical chart to track my work as to what row I'm on. It allows my eye to go right to that row. Can't make any mistakes. I'll use multiple sticky notes if the chart is that big and takes up like the entire length of the page, or the width of the page, I should say. So that's an option. All right, so those are my tips and tricks in general. Choosing the choice of yarn, making a great choice there with smoothness, color, and texture or elasticity. Practicing simple patterns to gain our cable experience and confidence, of course. Cabling without a needle, I feel, is essential for me, perhaps for you, perhaps will be for you, to really enjoy cable knitting and feeling sensational in knitting those cables. Including neighboring stitches. If you're creating your own garment, you're kind of freestyling with cables, making sure that you're positioning purl stitches, for example, as a neighboring stitches to make those cables really pop. Tracking your work, either through a device or through paper, I find is essential. Checking your work, just making sure that you're taking time to review and revise what you need before you have to do a massive rip out or frogging. And the last is just charts, considering printing cable charts that are multiple or a little challenging to do. And that's it. That's what I have for you. So I hope you go back into your knitting, you choose something cabley. If it's not right now because you're, banging out your gift knits or little knits that may not be cables, but for the Little Knits KAL, check it out. Maybe it's something that you want to consider into your new year, into your 2025, to start knitting cables, or adding one of the new tips and tricks as a technique into your cable knitting. Wishing you great joy in your knitting, be it cables, be it little knits, or whatever you're knitting on. And until next time, take care.